Welcome to the Scholars Chair. At Focus, a lecture by Islamic scholar Dr. Amina Wadud. She is speaking on Islam, feminism, and human rights.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I begin as always in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. I want to thank Professor Berger for negotiating this possibility with me. I was actually here for another forum in Rotterdam, and we were able to, with the hospitality of my brother Arnold Moore, allow me to stay a bit longer so I could speak with you. And hopefully we will have some interesting conversations afterwards. I'm actually going from a scripted paper, which I have reduced to try to keep within the time. That means that there may be some spaces that are, a bit rough because I, literally just reduced it. But I'm going to do that as a way to be able to stay focused because there's a lot that I want to cover. And the purpose of it really is to get to the place of a little bit of conversation about Islamic feminism, which I'm considering a methodology for the production and construction of new knowledge in living Islam. You will see that it will include critical reading of the classical intellectual canon of Islam, but with a lens that incorporates gender as a category of thought. Against the backdrop of the Arab Spring and the radical changes that are going on in the Middle East, this lecture focuses on Islam as a global phenomenon. In fact, there are more progressive gender debates in Indonesia than in all of the Arabic, Farsi, Urdu, and Turkish-speaking countries combined. This globalization lens has special benefit when looking at the development of the Muslim women's movement. It also helps to locate my work within that movement and grants it legitimacy. I have worked on gender issues in a way that would lead to Islamic feminism before it had a name and before I could own the word feminism as appropriate for my work and perspective. I do not now, nor have I ever, lost sight of my aim: to make certain articulations towards gender equality within the faith or from a faith perspective. I was born in the West to Christian parents. My sojourn in Islam had nothing to do with Western feminist movements because they tended to marginalize women of color, poor women, and non-heterosexual women. My principal motivation in the gender debates is linked to my spiritual yearnings. For God is bigger than any discourse, acts in ways not fathomable to human beings at all, and yet is intimately connected to each human being, even if they choose not to respond to that living presence or reality. So this benevolence is not intended to offend or to be imposed on people who do not believe in God. I say this instead because it is important to my location and to focus on theological elements in the debates over women's empowerment in the context of Islam. We cannot say anything about Islam and Muslims until we're clear what we mean by Islam. Every discussion about Islam and women must begin with the meaning of the word Islam. People involved with the struggle for or against Islamic reform often operate on a presumption that there is a uniform agreement on the meaning of the word. When people say, for example, Islam is a violent religion, or Islam means peace, or Islam prohibits homosexuality, or in Islam you must wear hijab, the source of such abstractions is frequently not provided. One important development that the women's movement helped to forge in international discourse at the end of the 20th century was the distinction between Muslim cultures and Islamic primary sources, that is, the Quran, the established Sunnah, authentic Hadith, and sometimes Islamic law or fiqh. And it's funny because in trying to get people to move away from certain static notions of Islam, even people who are working in progressive Islamic circles tend to defer back to these kind of conservative definitions when they're talking about Islam. So they make themselves as a response to or reaction or an alternative of. And part of what I'm trying to do is to get Islam to be, once again, more dynamic. In the Quran, the word Islam and Muslim are both used with reference to an historical community and to the state or posture, and to a state or posture vis-a-vis all of creation, the posture of conscientious surrender to the harmony of the universe. Indeed, the Quran says all of nature is Muslim. All of creation is harmonious, following a certain order with balance between its constituent parts. In all of my discussions about Islam and about Muslim women, I build upon a definition of Islam encapsulated by its most basic and fundamental principle, Tawheed. There is no Islam without Tawheed. At its most fundamental level, it refers to God as one. For matters of social justice, it refers to the more intensified form of its syntactical origin, the making of one from fragments, that is diversity or plurality. It could be then defined as unity. The social principle of Tawheed mandates a relationship between human beings of equality and reciprocity. The other question we have to figure out when we discuss Islam and women is, what is the role of women in Islam? I work only on the basis of an understanding that the role of a woman is to be a Khalifa on the earth, a moral agent of Allah within the sacred order of balance and harmony in the universe. This teleology is confirmed by the Quranic passage, Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa, indeed I will create an agent on the earth. Woman was not created as a byproduct of, helpmate for, or second-class citizen to man. Furthermore, her agency is in a direct relationship to God, unmitigated by men's agency, or by family. This agency is to be manifest by actions fil ard, in the creation, or literally on the earth, standing up for justice and gender equality, working to reform asymmetrical gender policies, and toppling tyrannical practices and epistemologies are thus essential to an agent as part of the human-divine relationship. These aspects of justice work are all mandated by Allah and established by the prophetic Sunnah. Coincidentally, this is the same as the role of men in Islam. Women are human. They do not depend upon men for their humanity. It is given to them by Allah. While women have always been a part of the community, expected to conform to the development of Islam within that community, in the early development of the foundational paradigms of Islamic thought and practice, they did not enjoy equal participation in establishing the fundamental understanding of what is Islam. In fact, as the Muslim empire spread geographically and politically, especially after the Abbasid period, women's contributions to the fundamental canon of Islam would be further marginalized and ultimately silenced. This had a profound effect on the future of Islamic thought and in the establishment of both legitimacy and authority. If we look back over Islamic history from our vantage point, we see a very minor role that women played in establishing the basic epistemology that would come to stand as authority or legitimacy. For example, in the 12th century, the famous and prolific scholar Ahmed al-Ghazali symbolized the agent, that is the Khalifa, the agent in Islamic philosophical terms, by comparison with the lute instrument, you know, the little blowing instrument. He even compared the number of orifices in the body with the number of holes in the lute. totally disregarding the distinctive number of orifices in the female body from the male body. Today, women are present and accounted for at every level of the community, including the scholarly and ritual community. Women participate fully in establishing new canon, constructing new traditions, forming new policies, living in the present, with a loving yet critical eye on the past and a conscious trajectory towards the future. This is proving to be a bit of a corrective for the asymmetry between women and men and Muslim communities. However, we do not go about this without some contention between our voices, perspectives, methods, and objectives. This is natural, inevitable, and for the most part useful. What I will describe here is the historical evolution of three major perspectives regarding Islam and gender reform. The names I have given to each are also not necessarily confirmed by consensus either. But I hope the way that I use these classifications will be self-explanatory and will facilitate discussion afterwards. Of course, in our history, there have always been some advocates for gender justice. We go back maybe to the Prophet's time. People like to mention one of the Prophet's wives, Salama, and after her interrogation of the Prophet about the nature of Quranic revelation and to whom that revelation was addressed, there was a verse revealed that was very explicitly inclusive, indeed, for all men and women who have rendered themselves unto Allah, for all truly devout men and all truly devout women, all women and men who are true to their word, all men and women who are patient in adversity, etc., etc. So there is already a sense in which there is a dynamic, but the voices were still very limited in number. So the point here is as if the Quran says that the Quran is addressed to both women and men. And it is, especially in terms of its ultimate objective, which is human guidance. And while the text is clear about this ultimate objective, there are still many passages in the Quran that address those who held greater privilege in that community. There are passages addressed exclusively to men as male persons. Throughout the text, there is an intricate balance between the speaker, Allah, the performance voice, the Prophet, the voice of those whose stories are told therein, and those to whom the text speaks, which is both the specific community living with the Prophet and all of humankind. Despite evidence of certain exceptional historical voices against gender inequality, today what we are experiencing is a mass movement of women and men against gender asymmetry as injustice. It matters very little if this injustice was established by intent or by accident of discrimination. The Muslim women's movements are also connected to certain global developments. Chief among these developments was the rise and fall of colonialism, and thus the rise of the nation state as a consequence of, for one thing, certain nationalist movements. Unfortunately, women were often not equal beneficiaries of the spoils of these new nationalist regiments. This is the place where the modern Muslim women's movement began in earnest. Like with the current Arab Spring, Muslim women stood side by side with their men or with Muslim men to throw off the shackles of colonialism and build nationalist movements. At that time, most women's organizations were branches of larger nationalist organizations. Once the victory of independence was won, it was not uncommon for women to be asked to return to the home and give up the ideas and the ideals of equal citizenship. And something similar is starting to happen in terms of the aftermath of the Arab Spring. This would herald in a new phase in women's activism that would be independent from the larger men or nationalist organizations for political, social, economic, and legal rights. As Margot Badran wrote, women had a rude awakening when it became clear that liberal men were not prepared to implement their promise to integrate women into public life after nominal political independence. The Muslim women's movement then dates back to this rupture between the development of the notion of free and equal citizens and the prohibition against women's full participation. The development of the nation state and the end of colonialism was also the beginning of a new global awareness. This awareness consists of recognizing local, regional, or national realities against and within the context of realities in a world unlike one's own. Such global awareness is the root of pluralism. Our humanity today is clearly possible only with this sense of pluralism. Pluralism includes the capacity to accept in equal terms that there are those who are different from us. This acceptance reflects our own local realities without projecting these as the ultimate human concern for everyone. The ultimate human concern is beyond narrow, local imagination and praxis, even as it must be seen as a reflection of the ultimate. Thus, our present time is not the only time. Our current place is not the only place. Our existing customs are not the only customs, our worldview not the only worldview. These basic elements of pluralism become essential for the global women's movement. The first wave Muslim women's movement consisted of a kind of methodological overlap and also some repetitions, all aligned with how the nation state would operate, including personal status law or family law, which would only be canonized after the colonial period. The first collective voices of gender reform were from well-to-do, well-educated, and often well-traveled women who had seen firsthand that the world is not uniform. They stood up as Muslim women and as citizens of these new nation states. After this first wave Muslim women's movement, the secular feminist and Islamist articulations of Muslim women's liberation would develop into opposing camps. So at first there was a little bit more integration, and then there's this development of an opposition, which is important to think about. The secular Muslim feminist movement is premised upon the idea that religions are the cause of women's oppression and that they are too patriarchal for redemption. Whether religion is relegated to a personal response or altogether irrelevant depends upon the religiosity of the individual. Deference is given unequivocally to the international instruments as developed by the United Nations and ascribed as universal. Quote, although universalism as it exists today is generally criticized for its implicit ethnocentrism and leaning towards so-called Western values, most women nevertheless recognize the need for, support the principle of, and work towards a new definition of universality in human rights. This discourse participates in the inherent conflict between women's rights and cultures. And according to Madhavi Sunder, but religion qua religion is less the problem than our traditional legal constructions of this category. Premised on centuries-old Enlightenment compromise that justified reason in the public sphere by allowing deference to religious despotism in the private, human rights law continues to define religion in the 21st century as a sovereign, extra-legal jurisdiction in which inequality is not only accepted but expected. Law views religion as natural, irrational, incontestable, and imposed, in contrast to the public sphere, the only viable space for freedom and reason. Simply put, religion is the other of international law, end quote. At the time of the establishment of the nation state, the crucial question of the role of religion in the political process led to two opposing sides. One advocating a separation of the state from religion, who would begin to self-identify as secular and sometimes Western, and the other constructing an unquestionable version of Islam as state and religion, or state and faith. The term secular would morph from the simple separation into its more aggressive form. The secularist outlook, quote, is basically one that starts by marginalizing God, or sometimes even announcing his death, placing the human at the center of the universe as its logo. This articulation of secularism would become even more coherent with the rise of the other outspoken public voice in favor of Islam, which would grow into political Islam, that is, the Islamist movement. Throwing off the shackles of colonialism meant challenging the very aspects of the colonialist's worldview. The most uniform response to the problems related to the post-colonial Muslim context was a cry to return to the glorious past of the Islamic Empire. With Islam as a solution, a new development emerged in the women's movement as well. Islam as a global phenomenon with a substantial history is, in fact, an important aspect of the debates. But the question is, can we or should we go back to it? The merit of the call to return to Islam was that it is both authentic and authoritative. However, as it continued, it moved to reject all other worldviews as un-Islamic. The Islamist agenda then mandates a return to a perfect Islam of the medieval period or of the time of the Prophet. The intent is to take the spirit of Islam and the soul of Muslim identity to organize the politics of a new world order. Quote, the idea for Muslim modernists was that the remedy for Islam consisted of a textual return away from the blemishes of the later phases back to the yearning for truth of the founders of Islam. In this, they found themselves oddly in full agreement with the Orientalists. They came to be suspicious of many traditions of Islamic thought and practice that developed through time, according to Omid Safi. The Islamist agenda is encapsulated within a cry for the return to Sharia. Quote, although the Islamist thesis that Islam is religion and state and consequently and necessarily requires the application of Sharia, it does not reflect the historical reality. It was and is hugely effective antithesis to secular ideas and authoritarian regimes. At the level of the general public, the cry for a return to Sharia is generally reductionist, collapsing the universal principles of Sharia with the juridical methods and mechanisms of implementation known as fiqh, or the codes that have been produced by this fiqh. The root definition of the word Sharia is the path that leads to water, that is the source of all life. Thus, it is universal, divine, sublime, and an ideal. The goal of this ideal society, or the maqasid, is justice. The more coherent definition of Islamic law that the Islamists are hoping to achieve is fiqh, which is the efforts across Muslim history for understanding that universal, or simply jurisprudence. To distinguish between these two is crucial for debunking the claim that somehow, if Muslim nation states were to establish Islamic law, then all problems would be solved. By toggling between the universal intent of Sharia, which is justice, and the human, necessarily fallible, thus subject to change, mechanisms for its implementation, or fiqh, the Islamists furthermore take license in condemning any who criticize their programs as if they are against Islam. Anyone who resists the establishment of their specific goals is deemed resistant to the implementation of the immutable divine order and even an unbeliever. However, Sharia cannot be implemented except through human procedural means, and that is fiqh, which has always been subject to debate, has always been diverse, has always been flexible. Thus, this lack of uniformity, which we can confirm even by today's modern existence of 4 major Sunni schools and at least 1 major Shia school, means there is no such thing as pure and simple Islamic law. We are up against different realities by the creation of the nation state as well, and by the pluralism of the continual relationship at an international level. There has yet to be a single system constructed by the Islamists that satisfies all the claims of Islamic authenticity and that fulfills all of their objectives. In the nation state, all policies are subject to public debate, including from non-Muslims. Implementation can only occur by the will of the people. People are open to disagree. However, it is clear that whoever has the power to enforce their understanding of Sharia can and will coerce that understanding over all others, even for matters of faith and individual consciousness. As Abdullah Naim says, Sharia principles cannot be enacted and enforced by the state as public law and public policy solely on the grounds that they are believed to be part of Sharia. If such enactment and enforcement is attempted, the outcome will necessarily be the political will of the state and not the Islamic law of Islam. The fact that ruling elites sometimes make claims to legitimize their control of the state in the name of Islam does not mean that such claims are true. The Islamist debates are critical for the women's movement because it usually comes down to the establishment of archaic, pre-modern Muslim personal status law or family laws. In the time of the formulation of Muslim personal status law, Muslim families were unconditionally patriarchal. Women who followed the Islamist agenda promote the significance of the sanctity of family without offering any analysis of what constitutes family and whether existing families are fulfilling the ideals deemed essential to that constitution. Any real crisis experienced in the family is instead simply charged as negligence of Islam. As such, these discussions become cyclical. The solution to family is Islam, and failed families are un-Islamic. Although an important public role for women has also resulted within the Islamist agenda, women's unquestionable obedience to family in its primitive patriarchal form is still unquestioned. Consequently, a bifurcation often occurs between women's